about that, I think it's time that we take on part 2 of my favorite video that I've ever watched, the Cold War II Oversimplified. We watched the Cold War Part 1. It was one of the worst videos I've ever seen in my life. It made me want to quit doing politics forever. So, I figured we should watch the second one. And maybe this will push me over the edge. And all the neoconservatives and liberals who hate me will rejoice. Because I quit politics. Let's go, baby. I agree, Jacob CT. Let's go.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community where you can...
Someone says, oh, part 2 gets worse? How that possible? How that even possible? Illinois State Fishing says, damn, watching this is going to give me a headache. I think this might be the end of me. I think I might lose my mind here today if this is worse than the last one. But I'll take your word for it. I'm expecting it to be worse now. Prepare for the worst, plan for the worst, hope for the best.
You can learn just about anything. Support my channel by signing up using the link below and get your first 2 months for free. For anyone who thinks recent U.S. history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is...
Sorry, I kind of spaced out at first, but they met at a bar. They were both arrested like 10 years before the Cuban Revolution even launched. I mean, I guess they were conspiring for a long time to overthrow the government, but they definitely didn't meet at a bar and say, hey, we should overthrow the government, and then did it the next day. It's something that they had to wait for the perfect time to do. Something that they were arrested for, like I said, before that even happened. Yeah.
Exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the U.S. immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any U.S. involvement in the plan, so he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending U.S. threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of...
I love how they give no credit to the Cubans. Right, the U.S. trained up these Cuban exiles and tried to invade the country, but because Kennedy didn't send enough air support to bomb the shit out of Cuba, it ended in a Cuban success. But it had nothing to do with the Cuban people wanting to maintain their sovereignty. That doesn't show that the Cuban people are opposed to U.S. militarism and U.S. imperialism. The fact that they defended themselves from this country who's so much larger, from the world's biggest military economic superpower, this small island country was able to defeat them in a battle. But it's just because we didn't send enough planes. When sending a bunch of air support and bombing Cuba may have brought the Soviet Union into the conflict and may have led to World War III. But then after that, they say, and Fidel Castro was still worried about his regime. He was so concerned after the Bay of Pigs about protecting his regime. Was he concerned about his sovereignty, not his regime, after the U.S. tried to invade his country? Yeah, I would be pretty worried about my regime too. If Russia or Canada invaded the United States, do you not think the U.S. State Department and the president should be worried? And would you say that they're worried about protecting their imperialist regime, which is what the U.S. is, or would you say they're worried about defending sovereignty and the democracy of their people, which in the case of Cuba is actually true. The U.S. attacked them and their people defended their sovereignty, and they've been defending against the U.S. empire, defending their sovereignty ever since. The CIA has tried to kill Fidel Castro literally like 600 times. So these people defending their democracy and their sovereignty, that's a regime. The U.S. who invaded them, we're a democracy. We're a democracy, and we actually have sovereignty. Even though there was just recently a democracy study done, and people in Cuba and China said more than anywhere in the world that they feel like they have democracy and control of their government, or at least they were both in the top 10, and the U.S. was near dead last. But we're the democracy. Cuba's a regime. The language and vocabulary of the empire.
medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October.
This is a great example of the great man of history fallacy and why Americans are anti-intellectual, to say it a nice way, or why the American masses are kind of dumb when it comes to politics and what our country does around the world. This is why the great man of history fallacy. There's a big reason why. Fidel Castro met Khrushchev, and they both said, we hate America so much we should be friends and team up to destroy America. Never, or forget the fact that America just invaded Cuba, and Cuba has never, ever attacked or even floated the idea of attacking America in their history. They're the aggressors for defending their country against the exiles who the U.S. trained up and invaded their country with. And then Cuba forged ties with the Soviet Union because Cuba was being run by Fidel by himself, just the one guy. Che was there a little bit, but it was mostly just dictator Fidel and his regime. And then the Soviet Union, this country of millions and millions and millions of people, this giant country, was being run by Khrushchev himself somehow. And then they found time in between running their entire country by themselves, running their regime by themselves, to meet up. They went for coffee, and they said, you hate America, right? Khrushchev asked Fidel. Fidel said, yeah, I hate America. They just invaded my country. And then they said, let's team up to destroy them. That's what happened. No, America put Cuba, after they failed to invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs, they put Cuba under the most stringent economic sanction regime in history, tied with the embargo or the sanctions that the U.S. has kept on the DPRK since killing 20% of their population in the Korean War. The embargo against Cuba and the embargo against the DPRK are most stringent of any sanctions or embargoes anywhere in the world. So the U.S. surrounded Cuba with their navy and their military, and they said, you cannot trade with anyone else in the world. You cannot trade. If you try and trade, we're going to intercept it with our military and navy. We're going to say you're, defying sanctions, and then we, have right to attack you or whatever. So Cuba has had to construct socialism, and they've, massively decreased illiteracy, malnutrition, given their people universal health care, brought health care and health facilities to rural areas that never before had them in the past. They've done this while being under this horrible economic embargo. But the Soviet Union, a socialist country, said, we don't care about the US's embargo. We're going to ally with Cuba and we'll buy sugar from them. And the USSR bought way more sugar from Cuba than what they really needed, because Cuba for years had been colonized by US multinational corporations and the US government. So their country, or their soil, was very monocropic. The soil, after having the same thing planted in it over and over again by these transnational corporations, who weren't reinvesting in developing Cuba's land, but were taking the wealth created by the Cuban soil and accumulating it in the West, that soil became monocropic, so it could only grow one thing. So Cuba can mostly only grow sugar and tobacco, and the Soviet Union says, no worries, we'll buy all your sugar, even despite the U.S. embargo. So for years, Cuba's economic construction and their socialist construction is largely financed by the Soviet Union, who they're selling sugar to in order to avoid the U.S. embargo. And when the Soviet Union dissolves in the early 90s, it's basically a disaster for Cuba economically. Fidel tells the people, we're not going to be as rich as we were. We have to diversify our economy and find a way to do this without the Soviet Union's help. And they did. They went through the economic struggles. People fled Cuba quite a bit during that time, but they were able to bring their economy back to life without the Soviet Union, even in the face of the U.S. embargo, and remain socialist, remain a Marxist country against U.S. imperialism, defying the U.S. empire just a few miles away. So now think of that complex story that I just told you about how the actions of the U.S. empire affected the Cuban economy, Cuban production, which Marx tells us to start our analysis from production. That prevented Cuba from developing production and expanding production. So they had to go, because of that U.S. embargo, had to go to the Soviet Union and trade sugar, which had many, many other economic effects on the people of Cuba. What makes more sense and sounds like a better history of Cuba, a more detailed and accurate history of Cuba? What I just told you, which is all true and which is what actually happened, or what this video with millions of views just told you? That Fidel and Khrushchev met up for coffee one day and decided to try and destroy the US. Which story seems more realistic? Because the story that I told you, the true story, the story that goes into the interrelation between economics, politics, foreign policy, trade, all of this, that's the true story. And this oversimplified story is nonsense, but this is the story Americans believe. This is the one everyone believes. They think that all socialist countries were just run by these dictators who decided to try and destroy America one day for fun. As America is sending, planes to bomb Cuba and training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba, we're calling them the aggressors. So Americans don't have an idea of what politics actually are, right? How production affects politics, what American foreign policy is, why other countries have different interests than us. We don't understand this. We think countries are just run by leaders. And every leader who the U.S. tries to destroy or overthrow or bomb is just an evil comic book villain, teaming up with all the other evil comic book villains to destroy American freedom. And it's absurd. And this is why Americans don't understand politics and why I want to bash my head into a wall every day.
Idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The U.S. Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The U.S. did the same and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The U.S. finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the U.S. were set to decide the day and time for their Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba.
Someone says, I love how there's no mention of the fact that there are already nukes in Turkey. Right? They just mention that as, all U.S. imperialist propaganda does. They only mention that when it becomes part of the story. And the U.S. said they'd remove their nukes from Turkey. Wait a second. So the U.S. had nukes in Turkey? So the U.S. was already pointing nukes at the Soviet Union and invading Cuba with our air raids and training up Cuban exiles. But then when Cuba wants bombs or nukes for self-defense, after the U.S. invades them, that's reason to almost push the world into World War III, into nuclear apocalypse. Yet the U.S. is allowed to surround the Soviet Union with nukes, and we're not even going to talk about it? Crazy. Now you see how they, how they lie by omission in order to push a certain narrative. It's not necessarily that they're just making up pure blatant lies all the time. A lot of times they'll lie by omission to not give you the full context of what's going on, right? They'll be like, the Soviet Union was trying to send nukes to Cuba for no reason. Well, hold on. The U.S. had just invaded Cuba and surrounded the Soviet Union's borders with nukes. So that kind of justifies this a whole lot more.
And the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the...
Yeah, that explains Brezhnev. They got rid of Khrushchev because he sucked, by the way.
Prospect of nuclear war. But still, the arms...
He didn't suck. He's still better than every U.S. president at the time. But compared to Stalin and even Brezhnev, not ideal.
race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they'd be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you going to do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah, I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight.
Maybe they didn't actually lose their bombs. How do we lose so many bombs? What is that? Is that just what the U.S. says when they want to put a nuclear weapon in like Israel or something, but they don't want to tell anyone about it? Which, by the way, Israel has nuclear weapons, as the U.S. and Israel are trying to attack Iran, claiming that Iran is creating nuclear weapons when Iran agreed to have their nuclear arsenal monitored 24/7 by an International Atomic Energy Agency, who never once in the time when they were monitoring Iran accused Iran of making a nuclear weapon. And the U.S. gives Israel nuclear weapons and then says, we need to attack Iran because of nukes. When, historically, nukes have been like the one way that countries have been able to get the U.S. to not invade them and not destroy them, get the U.S. off their backs. But yeah, is that what the U.S. says when they want to give a nuke to somewhere like Israel? Like, oh, we lost it. Yeah, sorry about that. The hydrogen bombs, we dropped those on our way over here. They're somewhere. What the heck? And then they're like, the Soviet Union didn't drop any, or they didn't lose any hydrogen bombs. So that means they could be anywhere. Like, what the hell are you talking about? How are you taking the U.S. losing a bunch of hydrogen bombs, losing a bunch of incredibly devastating weapons and nuclear reactive weapons around the world, and then blaming that on somehow finding a way to put that on the Soviet Union because they didn't lose a bunch of nuclear weapons? Like, oh, we don't know how many they lost. Maybe they didn't lose a bunch of nuclear bombs because they're not this giant destabilizing empire that stretches across the world with thousands of military bases and U.S. spy planes flying over everyone they don't like. When you don't do that, it's probably easier to keep track of your bombs, I guess. I don't know. I've never run an imperialist or socialist military before.
After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist.
No, it wasn't divided into two. Nobody liked the anti-communist regime in the south. It was U.S.-backed and armed right-wingers who nobody supported, which is why the U.S. had to go and do Vietnam. And then after the U.S. left Vietnam, still nobody supported these people, and they chased them out literally as the U.S. was leaving. The Vietnamese chased out the U.S. puppet government in Saigon.
Regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the North established the national...
It's the same thing what they did with Korea. You don't get to say that Kim Il-sung and Ho Chi Minh were evil, ruthless dictators because they wanted to reunite their country when you occupied half their country. If Russia came and occupied half the United States, killed millions of our people, and started stealing all our resources and backing fascist right-wing groups in the United States, and then somebody from the West or from the other half of the United States that wasn't occupied by Russia said, hey, we should take our own land back, that's not being a ruthless dictator. That's called defending your country from imperialism and imperialist aggression, which is what Ho Chi Minh did. And it's incredibly inspiring. And the U.S. Did horrific amounts of damage in Vietnam, left so many dead and so much trauma, destroyed the infrastructure of Vietnam, made a very easy transition into socialism, a very difficult transition into socialism by bombing all their agriculture and industry and getting their soil filled with Agent Orange and napalm and all these other toxic chemicals. And then Ho Chi Minh fights against that, and that makes him a ruthless dictator. Shut the hell up. Shut the hell up. You're an idiot. You're a chauvinist idiot. Whoever made this video.
National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the South with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong. And over the next decade, the situation escalated.
More and more South Vietnamese supported the Viet. They always supported the Viet Minh. It's not the Viet Cong. That's literally a pejorative that the U.S. military came up with to call these people when they were there trying to massacre them and occupy their country. Started calling them the Kongs when it's actually the Viet Minh. And the South never had any support. You know, they never had any real grassroots support, the same way South Korea never had any grassroots support, which is why the U.S. eventually ended up doing wars in both places. It's literally the exact same as Korea, where everybody was like, no, we support Ho Chi Minh. We don't support the U.S.-backed fascist groups or occupied Vietnam. So they started liberating their own country, and that's when the U.S. started bombing everybody. But apparently Ho Chi Minh's the dictator for that, not Henry Kissinger and the evil pieces of garbage who leveled a huge percentage of Vietnam and Korea with bombs because they wanted their independence.
To a breaking point, America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops. And so in they went. From 1965, America found its...
Losing South Vietnam. America had to send in the troops or we would lose South Vietnam. What do you mean lose it? It's not fucking ours. It's Vietnam. It literally, it's in the name. Vietnam. It belongs to the Vietnamese. What do you mean we had to send in troops or we would lose it? First of all, you just said South Vietnam was its own independent thing. You know, it wasn't an artificial government propped up by the U.S. and U.S. intelligence agencies, which it was. But then you say that, you know, once the North came into the South, that's when the U.S. was forced to send their troops. Otherwise, we would lose South Vietnam. I thought it wasn't ours. I thought it was just South Vietnam. And why does the U.S. have the right to invade countries or we might lose them? What do you mean by that? I mean, I know this is propaganda and whoever came up with this probably knows what they're doing, right? They probably know that they're creating propaganda. But how as a normal person, could you like read the script of this and be like, this is, you know, and not be like, this is ridiculous. This is the most ridiculous shit I've ever read. The U.S. needed to invade Vietnam or they would lose South Vietnam. It's not ours. It's Vietnam. Again, using the same example, if Vietnam took over half the United States and then the half that wasn't took over said we should go get the rest of the United States back, get the rest of our territory back, would the U.S. media portray them as evil dictators for doing that? Would they say Vietnam needed to send in their troops at that point in order to get the eastern United States back? No country even thinks like that or would suggest such a ludicrous thing, because no country thinks like the United States. No country is as arrogant as the U.S. empire and thinks that, you know, you can invade countries and destroy their infrastructure and agriculture and bomb children and blow up their schools, as long as it lets you keep half the country for yourself because it's ours. Yeah, we're the U.S. We can take every country we want.
Itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier. Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder.
That's what you call the crossfire. You call Operation Rolling Thunder crossfire. The U.S. invaded their country, occupied the South, and then started bombing the shit out of the North the same way that they did to North Korea, dropping tons and tons of Agent Orange and napalm, leaving the country toxic and leaving their farmland toxic for years, making it extremely difficult for them to grow food even after the U.S. left. That's civilians getting caught in the crossfire? No. And if you learn about Vietnam specifically, the tactics of the Viet Minh were so good, the guerrilla warfare tactics, because they understood the jungle and they understood their own homeland. The Americans eventually didn't know what to do, and they were scared all the time that they were going to get ambushed or whatever else. So they just started bombing and lighting on fire like vast swaths of jungle, right? And there are tons of examples of U.S. just blatant massacres of women and children in Vietnam, probably because, they didn't know who they were fighting, right? A lot of times people would dress as women and children, but then they would be soldiers and they would attack the U.S. You want to know why? Because the U.S. was invading and occupying their country. So they knew how their country worked. They knew where to hide. They knew how to do military operations. And the U.S. just kept drafting young people and sending them to go fight and die in this death trap. And then we bomb millions of acres of farmland and kill countless numbers of people in the north in Operation Rolling Thunder. And this propaganda nonsense is like, oh, that's just people getting caught in the crossfire. No, that's people being directly targeted. People's land and territory and political system being directly targeted for takeover by the U.S. empire. And then the U.S. empire killing as many young American people, young American soldiers drafted into the military as they need to, and killing as many people in Vietnam as they need to, and destroying as much of Vietnam's economy as they need to in order to do it, in order to take this place over. That's what this is. It's not crossfire between two equal sides. It is the imperialist slaughter of the heroic Viet Minh people who defeated the U.S. and maintained their economic and political sovereignty. That's what the Vietnam War was.
The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua.
How is this not the same thing? How is this not the same thing that the U.S. was doing in South Vietnam? It's just the same thing, but the U.S. didn't, end up going in and bombing half the country and destroying the entire country's infrastructure and killing 20% of people the same way they did in Korea and Vietnam. But that doesn't mean they won't do it. They did the same thing in Iraq. A lot of what would happen was the Soviet Union and China were part of the UN Security Council. And when that was created, like the first 58 vetoes, because any country in the Security Council has veto power, was the Soviet Union vetoing the US trying to bomb some country or trying to invade some country. The Soviet Union would say, no, you can't do that via the UN Security Council. So, a lot of the U.S.'s death and destruction came from people realizing how messed up Vietnam was and how evil the U.S.'s actions were in Vietnam and how destructive they were. So they had to slow down with just bombing countries to oblivion, the same way they did to Korea and Vietnam. Because it didn't work. Both those countries remain communist and socialist and are going to hate the U.S. forever because of what the U.S. has done there. So that didn't work. So they tried to start doing things more covertly. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, immediately, you have the beginning of the Gulf War. And the U.S. You have the bombing and carpet bombing of Yugoslavia and the destruction of Yugoslavia. You have all these different proxy wars that the U.S. has been doing around the world, which now become like hot wars, right? Which become actual U.S. military occupations. And that's, again, slowed down in recent years. But it's largely the Soviet Union and China who were combating this every step of the way, not so much China at this point. But a lot of the times, the reason the U.S. wasn't able to just send troops into Nicaragua the way they had in the past was because of the Soviet Union. But they act like these are just equal powers, just backing proxy wars around the world. And no. You got a super chat here. Is there a comprador ultra left in the West? People like Paul Mason. That's a good question. Well, I'll answer that question after we finish about half this video. Yeah, we're about done here.
These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering throughout the Third World. And in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became this became this, and this became this. The new slogan that was taking root: make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable, and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made...
So I should point out that this is wrong too. The CIA was largely supporting the hippie movement. And the U.S. just found that their wars in Vietnam... I mean, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the U.S. continued the Vietnam War for years, continued bombing their people and their infrastructure for years after they knew they were going to lose. The U.S. knew they had no chance of occupying or turning Vietnam capitalist, but they continued to bomb them out of spite and to try and make Vietnam, make transitioning to socialism as hard as they possibly could make it for Vietnam. So, it had the withdrawal from these wars wasn't just the hippie movement in the U.S. forcing the government to withdraw from these wars. It was the U.S. empire changing strategy. The same way them pulling out of Afghanistan wasn't because of any protests or anything we did here at home. I mean, the hippie movement was larger than the Afghanistan protests. But what I'm saying is that the CIA was actually supporting the hippie movement through various things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which you can Google. Because they didn't want people to be socialists and communists. They didn't want people to see, hey, our government, our imperialist capitalist government is killing, massacring, and destroying any country who tries to become socialist, like Korea or Vietnam abroad. So we should become socialist and turn America into a socialist country so we can have a foreign policy of mutual development. And we can work together with countries like Vietnam instead of sending all our young people to fight and die and get PTSD in a horrific war while bombing the country to oblivion. We should trade with them and be allies with them, socialist foreign policy. And the way to do that is through class struggle, engaging in class struggle in the U.S. so we can eventually have a revolution in the U.S. The U.S. State Department did not want people thinking like that. But there was a huge anti-war sentiment in the U.S. as people were watching the Vietnam War on their TVs for the first time and seeing the destruction firsthand. So the U.S. State Department and the CIA did everything they could to get people to join the hippie movement, including, putting drugs and LSD onto the streets. Did everything they could to get people to join that instead of the socialist movement. So then you hear, that idea that once you become, once you grow up, you won't be left wing anymore. You'll be right wing once you get a real job and become an adult. That largely started with the hippie movement, because you had a lot of people who were thinking, make love, not war. Let's just go to Woodstock and roll in the grass all day, and Vietnam's bad and that'll end the war. Instead of, hardcore socialist, communist organizing workers, the masses, theoretically, as well as materially and economically and ideologically, organizing them in order to fight the imperialist ruling class, in order to identify the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, as the ruling class and the state as their tool, and then to fight and struggle against it. That's not what the State Department wanted. And so they push people into the hippie movement, which is more like, let's just, we'll all go to Woodstock and hold up, make love, not war signs, and eventually the war will go away. It's very disorganized, disjointed. And then, a lot of those hippies grew up and got real jobs that sucked and where they're getting exploited every day. And they're like, oh, this is just the way of the world, and a lot of them are like Republicans now. There's so many Republicans today, conservatives today, who are in the hippie movement. And they'll tell you like, oh, once you grow up and get a job, like then you'll be a right-wing conservative. It's like, no, because I have the science of Marxism, Leninism. I'm not just some hippie who saw Vietnam happen on TV and got angry about it for 5 minutes. The more I work, the more I understand exploitation, right? The more I understand that my labor is being used to create wealth for somebody else who's not putting in any labor. And that there's a much, much better, more rational way to organize labor within our society. I learned that the more I work. I learned that more the older I get. Versus a lot of the hippies did not learn that. And then, a lot of them are conservatives now. Which is why the CIA supported it. Congress for Cultural Freedom. Give it a Google.
And turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers.
The South immediately fell. The U.S. just likes to say that it lasted for a while.
In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did
they weren't hungry. The Soviet Union was having to put a lot of money into their military budget, more than they wanted, to stop the U.S. from destroying them. And the consumer goods thing was real. Like, U.S. propaganda was saying, socialist countries don't have consumer goods, and socialist countries were producing, most of what they used, and they were focusing less on producing consumer goods for people to buy. Whereas, they were focusing more on the essentials in countries like Cuba, especially, who are under economic embargo and who are smaller, not superpowers like the Soviet Union. And, consumerism kind of became intertwined with imperialism at this point. The U.S. propaganda was saying, look at all the consumerism of the Western world. And a lot of people in socialist countries sort of fell into this idea, right? That, oh, maybe, capitalism is way richer and our government's just lying to us and we're going to get all these consumer goods. And that's a big part of the reason, so many old people in the Soviet Union or former Soviet Union, 75% of people who lived in the Soviet Union now want a return to that economic model. Because once they actually got capitalism, they realized that the West had lied, that they got consumer goods, but also it was a human rights disaster in the Soviet Union. You had unemployment, which hadn't existed forever, went up to 20%. Malnutrition went up. Drugs and sex trafficking flowed back over the border, which hadn't existed under socialism. So they got all the crappy parts of capitalism too. And that's why you have the saying of former Soviet citizens, everything our government told us about communism was a lie, but everything they told us about capitalism was true. So maybe, we didn't establish the dream of communism. We didn't establish a stateless, classless society. That's what they're saying. That part wasn't true. Now, government told us that for sure we were marching towards that. But everything they told us about capitalism was true. They told us that in the U.S., there's, vast wealth. There's tons of consumer goods, but there's people living on the streets, and there's people going hungry. There's people experiencing mental health crises in all the cities on the streets, and nobody helps them. Nobody takes care of them. You just walk by and continue with your own life. That's kind of the kind of society Americans have. And Russians saw that. And they saw that society versus the old socialist society. And now 75% of them are like, oh, the socialist society was better. All right, we'll watch this. We'll watch one more little segment here.
They have to show for it. They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT Agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in
Was through ping pong? Dude, who even wrote this? It was China's market reforms. Again, with them just ignoring the economic factors. Same thing as with Cuba, where they said that the leader of Cuba, Fidel, and the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, just met up and they hate America, so they teamed up. No, it was because Cuba was under an embargo and the Soviet Union was the only people who would buy their sugar. In the U.S. under China under Mao had closed off their economy, but under Deng, they were saying, we're going to open up our economy to investment from the outside world, and we're going to control that investment and continue trying to construct socialism. So the U.S. was like, oh, yeah, money, 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 money. We'll definitely invest in China. And they just assumed at this point that China had gone capitalist, China had gone liberal, which is not true. If you read what the Chinese scholars and Marxists are saying, that's never been the case. That's never been what's known as the market reforms and opening up were about. But the market reforms and opening up are why Nixon went there. Relations between China and the U.S. didn't change at this time because of ping pong. You see what I mean by this great man of history stuff is why the U.S. citizens are uninformed and sometimes come off as just straight up dumb. There's complicated reasons, extremely complicated reasons for why the U.S. was now more willing to work together with China economically versus under Mao before. But you're going to just say it was ping pong? Dude, you make our whole country a joke. If someone else who has any kind of understanding of history saw this and was like, this is how Americans learn history, I'm like, yeah, I don't know. They just kind of believe anything. Like, it's a joke. Ping pong. The market reforms in China were ping pong.